was okay. So you heard it. All right. So I'm here with Tony Liao, but I know him as Tony because I grew up with him with that name in childhood. But I believe, do you go by Chung Lee in your formal setting? Do you go by Chung Lee or do you go by Tony?
No, Tony's fine.
Okay, all right, good deal. Childhood friend of mine, and you teach. Can you tell us a little bit about your Excuse me. Let's try that again. Tony, tell us a little bit about your background in augmented reality, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So I started my master's program at Cornell University in around 2008. And that was around the time when the first smartphones were coming out, right? Like
Mhm.
the first iPhone was like the invention of the year in 2007. And I think even back then, we sort of knew that it was going to be a really big deal. And it was right around that time when people started realizing that a lot of the stuff that we needed for augmented reality in the lab, like the really heavy backpacks, the processing, the eyeglasses, those were all coalescing on our phones. And
Uh-huh.
so the first real augmented reality apps started becoming possible on smartphones. And that was when I started doing research into augmented reality applications and thinking about some of the implications that it could have for our world and our society if you could start overlaying digital content on top of physical space.
Cool. So you used to have, you said like a backpack and a bunch of other stuff to like enable augmented reality in the early days.
Yeah, so back in the early 2000s, computing was a lot more expensive, right?
Mhm.
And you didn't just have GPS on any device. That was the other thing about the phone, right? So you needed GPS, you needed a compass, you needed mobile computing power,
Mhm.
and the only way to get that before our smartphones was to literally haul around like a desktop with you so that you could have that in space. And so that used to be like 20, 30 pounds. And then once it started becoming publicly available, that's really when I started studying it. So I got my doctorate at Cornell, and then I became a professor at Temple University, and then I was a professor at the University of Cincinnati for a few years. And most recently, I am taking a job at the University of Houston, running and directing their new Cougar lab, Cougar with the AR capitalized, uh,
Ooh.
augmented reality social
I
science.
got excited there when you said cougar for a second, but I take it that it isn't about what I'm thinking.
It could be both.
So tell us a little bit about your cougar lab.
So we haven't gotten it started yet, but I'm really excited about it because uh, essentially there's been a lot of developmental work in augmented reality, mostly um, like it has to do with making the technology possible. I think we've gotten to this point where we're pretty good at a lot of the technological things, right? You can go and buy a HoloLens or a Magic Leap or some set of AR glasses, and that's publicly available off the shelf for people to buy. So the technology is starting to get there. What we don't really have a good sense of is some of the social questions surrounding augmented reality. And so that's really what I was building my AR lab, my Cougar lab, to do, is investigate some more of the social science questions, whether that's psychology, sociology, human interaction, communication, around using some of these augmented reality and virtual reality devices.
Okay, well,
So,
that sounds interesting. Would you mind maybe diving into a specific, conundrum or sort of existential question that you plan to or are investigating under that umbrella?
yeah. So I'll talk about a couple of studies that I've done recently, and maybe some of the ones that I plan to continue doing once I get there.
That'd be great.
Uh, So one of the first questions that I was interested in was how augmented reality could affect our sense of space and place. Because essentially what it allows for is for you to move through space with a different view of what space looks like. Okay.
Mhm.
Uh, that previously wasn't possible, right? We used to have to go through space and see exactly what the spatial physical features were. Um, in an augmented sense, you could essentially walk through the world with multiple channels, right? Or different channels of reality for what it was that you were looking at. And so one of the things that we've been interested in is how does that overlay affect people's actual sense of space and place?
Okay.
So we recently conducted a study where we took people around town and showed them augmented reality crime information. So you know how you can go on those spot crime or like Life 365, and you can see where crime has happened in your neighborhood.
Uh-huh.
See those like 2D maps. What we did was we essentially took those and overlaid them onto an augmented reality screen and had people walk around their neighborhood seeing crime information.
Wow. So it's like, you know, I think I get this is an extreme example, but like, oh, someone was murdered on this street corner, for instance.
I mean, we basically just took public information, right? I mean, so it could have been a murder, right? But
Yeah.
it was like assault happened here 3 days ago, or like
Wow.
burglary happened here 2 days ago. And essentially, what we were doing was we were trying to assess how people felt about being in that place, whether their perceptions changed about that place, walking through it with this information, and how they reconstructed the event and how they reconstructed the space with this channel on walking around.
And what do you hope to discover or conclude with examining this?
I think what we so we've gotten a pretty good sense of how people interact with space in a physical sense, right? We've done it our entire lives. You walk through a space and you look around and you see the architecture, you see the buildings, you see, oh, you know, does this look like a good neighborhood, or does this look like maybe it's a little run down? You know, is there evidence of crime? Is there evidence of litter? What are the people doing, right? And that constructs your sense of space in a physical sense. What we don't know is how adding additional information, adding additional visual information could change that perception or change people's experience of that space and place. And so we were testing crime, but you could imagine any number of hundreds of layers of moving through space, right? And that would change your physical perception. You could have a history layer as you move through. You could walk through the space and have it be, you know, 1950 or 1960 or a different view of what that space looked like, or, you know, remove certain things about that physical space. So what it essentially allows for, what we're hoping to see, is what is a potential future human experience look like in an augmented world if some of this stuff is possible, right? So you've seen probably like Ready Player One or Black Mirror or some of like the, you know, VR stories where they're
Red Snow Crash back in the day.
Live in a virtual reality universe and will be divorced from reality. I tend to think that those are overblown, right? Yeah, we want to escape from reality for a bit, but I tend to think that most people, they want to stay in reality, okay? Like, we want our reality to be our experience, but maybe we want it to be a little bit different, right? Like, more people are slightly changing their realities than they are saying, I want to escape the reality completely.
Mm.
So our research is looking at what could be possible when we are able to visually transform our physical realities as we move through them. Both what people choose to do and also how some of those things could emotionally affect us, psychologically affect us, and socially affect us if now we're moving through space with augmented layers on our reality and other people don't know what we're looking at, or we're experiencing the world in a different way than everybody else is around us.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
We see stories of people, you know, with playing Pokemon Go, right? They're playing Pokemon Go in the Holocaust Museum, right? Or they're playing Pokemon Go at a funeral, and it's not appropriate, right?
Yeah.
But the augmentation is telling them to do this, but physical space is telling them this is not okay, right?
Is
And so
addiction a part of that?
oh, sorry.
Does addiction have anything to do with that?
It does, but I think it's just that the augmented space can give us different cues and different directives, even though we're moving in the same physical reality. And that's, I think, going to be the interesting thing, where we might be over privileging the augmented space and, you know, at the expense of our physical reality as we move through it, if that's the channel that we choose to move through space with.
Yeah. Kind of makes me think of some of my students like with earphones in when I'm like trying to tell them like, hey, you need to do this and that to pass the class, and they're not even listening to me
Yeah,
because they're in their own world.
that's one. So understanding how augmented reality could affect physical space and place, that's sort of one line of research, because we want people are going to move through space with some of these technologies, and we want to know, at least early on, what some of that construction looks like. A second sort of thread that we've been taking is to see some of the psychological effects of these technologies for human development. So we recently did a study about 6 to 8 year old children and placing them in virtual reality environments,
Mhm.
and
Oh gosh.
whether or not they believed that the virtual reality was a real place that they went to.
Oh gosh.
Um,
Are there any conclusions that you're able to draw from that?
So we found it was super interesting. So these 68-year-old kids, we strapped them in a VR headset. Their parents were watching in the next room. Parents got a kick out of it. It was really cute. Um, but what we saw, and we asked them afterwards, was the dinosaur real? Did you really go swimming? Like, how could you tell it was real or not real? So it was really interesting because reality doesn't exist on us. It's not a yes or no question, right? Like, there are things that are real, but they, don't exist, right? Or there's things that are fake, but you believe to be real, like Santa Claus, right?
Mhm.
Or there's historical figures who are real, but you don't necessarily ever interact with them, right? Um, so what we did was we asked them a series of questions about presence, how much they felt like they were transported into the virtual reality, and then how they could tell whether or not that reality was real. So we asked them questions like, could the virtual dinosaur see you? Like, did they believe that the dinosaur was a real entity?
Uh-huh.
Did they believe that the dinosaurs lived in the machine, or they existed somewhere else, they had transported into a new place? And just seeing the ways that they constructed reality and tried to test the reality, those I think were some of our really interesting findings. Like, uh, some of the children would step into the VR experience, and they would start holding their breath because they were underwater.
Oh wow.
Were like testing their visual cues were coming in. They were seeing that they were underwater, and then they were matching their physical actions to the reality that they were seeing, and then testing it as they went along, right? So they started touching, maybe trying to touch the dinosaurs, trying to move around them, trying to look around them. So I think some of the findings that we found most interesting was the ways that they tried to test the reality and then use those tests to then conclude whether or not it was real or not real.
Oh yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
Um, thank you for sharing that. To maybe shift gears a little bit on you, since like I said, I am in an education graduate program. What implications or what uses do you believe, as I would consider you an expert in the field, do you think augmented reality has? I get confused between augmented and virtual since we were shifting between the two, but what sort of future or promise or application do you see augmented reality having in, let's say, a K through 12 classroom, or beyond that in maybe a college level classroom?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, one of my doctoral students at Temple just did his dissertation on using VR to promote education and other purposes. So he would be a good person to talk to, although I supervise that project. And I think there are a myriad of uses, right? Like, if we think about the things that we want our children to do, or K through 12 education to accomplish, right? Maybe the first one is motivation, right?
Mhm.
We think about, the technologies can be a tool for motivating learning intrinsically amongst students. So that's, a lot of what the early uses of AR VR have been for, to say you can get students excited.
Uh-huh.
Want to be in the VR and AR environments. And those have been those have been useful, right? It is novel, it is new, it is cool. And so kids do want to be in them. Now, the issue with that, of course, is that maybe that motivation is temporary, right? Like, computers were super motivating for a while, and then now they're so normal that it's
Yeah.
it's not exciting anymore, right?
Yep.
Or now it's terrible because you're on Zoom all day, right? Like
Yep.
that temporary motivation factor it's real, right? So we can't dismiss it, but I don't think it should be the only thing that we think about when we test these education kind of studies. Um, I think maybe some of the more interesting things that I've seen have been related to the ways in which AR and VR can help with spatial and visual learning, or visual kinds of formats, right? So there may be certain things that you would be better able to teach if you were able to visualize them in a 3D environment.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Whether that's, something like a solar system where it's very difficult to, physically experience that. Science and biology, microscopic organisms that are difficult to understand and visualize, or potentially historical events that obviously, can't be reconstructed in a certain sense. So anything that you think about trying to teach, uh, the ability to add a visual component, three-dimensional experiential components, I think those are the possibilities that are going to be really fascinating. So we've already seen the New York Times. They've been doing some AR, VR stuff where they're trying to tell stories, right? Journalists, news stories of, the Syrian refugees, or
Mhm.
climbing Mount Everest, or the Mars lunar rover. These kinds of things where the ability to have that embodied experience could actually be more immersive and be something that is more instructive, and helps students learn in a more embodied and immersive way. Those are, I think, the things that are really exciting about AR VR.
Cool. Yes. Thank you for offering that perspective. Um, I guess we'll wrap up with this last question, and thanks so much for taking the time. Where do you see that there is enough demand to supply the market with a cheap version that would enable some of these technologies? Like you mentioned, like a virtual solar system or an AR solar system. Do you think that the market will have that demand to supply it cheaply enough, or do you think we're a ways away from that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I think that the market for the technology should not be the problem, right? Like if you think about, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this big push to like throw iPads into the classroom, right? Like,
Mhm.
or maybe it was like 10 years ago. I remember certain school districts were like, we're going to spend, or we're going to partner with Apple. They're going to give us like an iPad for every student or something
Mhm.
like that, right? And that's going to be the thing for education
That's going
in.
to answer all of our problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And obviously now we're finding some of that research, now 10 years later, was like, yeah, that wasn't the best thing to do. Not because the iPad wasn't great, not because there wasn't access, but because the things that you were having students do on those iPads, those kinds of technology, or the software, the tools, and the teacher's ability to teach with those were maybe the things that were lagging behind a little bit, right?
Okay.
Plus, the iPad came with everything that the iPad comes with. And so you could have the best educational software on the iPad and then the internet, right? It's
Yes,
like,
the rest of the internet.
and what, yeah, plus the internet, plus, Angry Birds, plus Candy Crush. Like,
Yeah,
putting all of those things on a single device may not be the best, is what we found, right? It's really hard to compete against YouTube. I mean, to
I
be,
completely agree. That's what whenever they're talking about like, well, the kids have the smartphones, they can just teach themselves. And I'm like,
yeah,
dude, like all these programs are great, but like you can't always monitor them, and I'm competing with their attention for the rest of the entire internet, and I'm
exactly.
losing.
Like, giving them an iPad, you're basically giving them an instrument, and some people may be able to make extraordinary music out of it, and other people may just be able to bang the keys a little bit, right? I
Mhm.
think uh, having the tool and the direction, that's really the key. So I think the devices won't be the problem, right? I think the problem will be the rest of the market where, are we going to incentivize the making of educational technology and educational materials? Or are we going to incentivize gaming, marketing, and entertainment and all the other things, right? The things that are happening in VR right now and AR right now are games, right? That's where the market is, because that's where people have disposable income. Gamers are used to buying other devices. The companies know that they're kind of on a cutting edge, and Microsoft, Sony, they're willing to experiment when it comes to gaming because there's already a built-in market for that, right? If you make the next Call of Duty, you're making billions of dollars, right? If you make the next AR Call of Duty, or Pokemon Go is making millions and millions of dollars, right? The market for education isn't the same as those kinds of things. The market for education is a lot more nebulous because the gains are more nebulous. You're relying on school districts, you're relying on governments, you're relying on individual budgets to sort of fund these things. And so the technology, the software that is geared towards those things will be less robust than those other industries. And I think maybe that's kind of why we on the academic side say we still need to study this stuff from a social science perspective, right? Education is a component of what we want to do, and being able to study the things that make it effective for that, not just making it as immersive and entertaining as possible. We should be devoting the same amount of attention to making the technology work for educational purposes and pro-social purposes, as we do for gaming and entertainment. So that's what I hope to do, and hopefully we'll keep doing some of that stuff in our Cougar lab in the next few years.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This is Tony Liao of now University of Houston, excuse me. And thanks for taking the time, and enjoy. You've got a lot better background than I do, and they're both real. So I'd rather be where you are right now than this sort of horizontal prison that I have. But oh man, what is that?
San Francisco.
Man, looks like fun. All right, man. Well, I'm going to end recording here.